Hey, listeners, happy Pride Month. Over the next few weeks, we are going to be talking to queer activists for queer liberation, our movements for abolition and against criminalization. And I am super duper honored to begin Pride Month by talking to someone that I've known for many, many, many years, Kenyon Farrow. If you don't know Kenyon, you should. He's a writer, an editor, a strategist, an expert on a number of issues, including criminalization and mass incarceration, public health, housing, and so forth. Just brilliant. We have a very broad ranging conversation where we talk about youth homelessness, abolition, marriage equality, and the evolving meaning of Pride Month. So when we come back, we'll be joined by Kenyon. Kenyon, I'm so excited to talk to you. It's been a very, very long time. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. It's been a long time, but great to see you.
Awesome. So, you've worn many, many hats over the years. We know you're a writer, an editor, you've been a strategist, an organizer, a number of things. And then you've worked on a broad range of issues, from criminalization and mass incarceration to public health. That's probably what you're most known for. HIV, issues affecting queer and trans communities. It seems like a through line through much of your work has been really advancing a social safety net. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk to us about why Pride, because we're in Pride Month, should include this demand for support and resources for our communities.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that Pride Month should absolutely, first and foremost, be a place in which the queer and trans communities across the country not only kind of celebrate our surviving and thriving in the country in which we live in, the world in which we live in, but also should be a place where we really make clear our kind of political vision and political demands, right, for ourselves and for others. And I think that the sort of safety net is a key issue, I think, as it pertains to queer lives for several reasons. And so, when we talk about the social safety net, I mean, we're talking about essentially all of the kind of federal and then, to state and local kind of, programs that help prevent, poverty in a lot of cases, right? So whether we're talking about Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, TANF and food stamps, and other kinds of benefits like that, I think oftentimes the narrative that the right has been very good at sort of projecting really for the last 40 years has been, oh, the gay community is just a bunch of, rich white gay men with expendable incomes and no children, and therefore are not deserving of a range of whether civil rights protections or kind of inclusion in sort of social safety net programs as such, right? And I think when we look at the actual data, we see just the opposite is true. That actually, even to this day, despite the kind of gains that the LGBT community has made in terms of visual representation in popular culture and even post, kind of same-sex marriage becoming the law of the land, if you will, that still when you get down to brass tacks economic issues, LGBTQ people are still disproportionately poor, disproportionately use either welfare or food stamps, or are certainly largely disproportionately unstably housed and homeless, especially when we talk about LGBT young people. So, and then of course, when you add race and gender onto those dynamics, it's even worse for Black and brown LGBT folks, worse for women, cis women, or trans women for that matter, and trans men. And so it's still very much important that we as a community, while we celebrate this season, certainly not lose sight of, the kind of things that we need in terms of, policy from, our elected officials and from the federal government in terms of securing the lives and livelihoods of LGBT people across the country.
This makes me think back, years ago, before same-sex marriage became the law of the land, as you will, I heard you talk about this idea that, we have to think about looking beyond marriage, not just because not everyone wants to get married, but also because, marriage is an important issue and it's an important protection, but it doesn't protect everyone. And that really resonated with me as a young person because I was in a very precarious situation when it came to like my housing, when it came to even being able to feed myself. And so that resonated with me like, okay, great. Yeah, I want marriage, but I also, I need a stable place to live. I need all of these other things. And, right now, you're vice president of policy at Point Source Youth, an organization that's working to end youth homelessness. I was wondering if you could talk about how pervasive this issue is and why ending youth homelessness is necessary to ensure the well-being and safety of LGBTQIA youth.
Yeah, so I think when you look across the country, and we've known this at least since I've been doing this work for over 20 years, year after year, the data sort of demonstrates no matter what city you look at across the country or what state, when you look at the numbers of young people who are homeless around the country, you see disproportionate rates of homelessness among LGBT youth. And to the extent that you often hear LGBTQ people make up anywhere from roughly 5 to 10% of the population. When you see that in most places at least 25%, and in some places as much as half of all homeless youth are LGBTQ young people, by any stretch of the imagination, that is a national crisis. And again, that has been true for as long as I've been doing this work, right? At least since the early 2000s. And yet we, kind of as you mentioned, in the first decade of the 21st century, we really spent most of our kind of resources, political capital, advocacy organizations, really focused on marriage as kind of the premier issue. And in fact, kind of in some ways help promote the idea that once we get same-sex marriage, then everything else will be great, right? Meanwhile, we still don't have any federal kind of legal protections for, employment discrimination. We still have such great levels of housing instability and homelessness. And so just by the nature of the actual data, knowing that, a quarter to 50% in any given place of homeless youth, in fact, are LGBTQ youth, should be something that we should, frankly, all be more focused on nationally. And I think that when we look at even, frankly, what some of the, kind of solutions are, which are often based on, kind of voucher programs, right? So giving people sort of a housing voucher, whether through the, housing for people living with, AIDS program, the HOPA program, or through, YHDP, which is the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project program at HUD, et cetera. We know that a lot of times landlords don't even want to take those, right? Because of their assumptions about, people who are poor and, what sort of they're going to do to the property or quote unquote, bring down the neighborhood, et cetera. So what ends up happening is even for young people or LGBT people who get access to those kinds of vouchers, there's still massive discrimination in the housing market, right? And so we see young people, many times who've been turned away or, kicked out of their homes, or their home environments are otherwise, inhospitable. And so they, leave, if you could say of their own accord, but certainly because the conditions are not safe for them in many places, end up on the street. And so for, PSY, or Point Source Youth, which is the organization that I work for, we are really looking to develop and are implementing with partners across the country youth-driven solutions that actually sort of prioritize getting young people into housing first and giving young people options into what kind of housing that they want, right? That feels the most safe and secure to them. And so that can include kind of host homes or, rapid rehousing programs. And our kind of most newest sort of strategy is really providing direct cash transfers to young people for housing. So, which is to say that we, raise money, partner with a community-based organization to provide, anywhere from $1,000 a month to $1,500 a month, depending on the local circumstances, for young people to be able to just get that money directly to them, no questions asked, as a means to keep them stably housed, while they also get to then opt into other kinds of like peer support or case management or support services. So if they want to use that, 2 years while they're in this program to then, pursue finishing high school or GED or going to college or, getting into HIV care services or PrEP services or other things that they need in order to sustain themselves, that they're really leading those decisions, right? And we are providing the economic tools to do that. And I think one of the kind of questions that we often get is, well, aren't you scared they're just going to, use the money and smoke weed or, blow it at,
Yeah.
shopping or whatever the case may be. And that's not what we're seeing around the country. We're doing, some research with Chapin Hall out of University of Chicago to really be able to say definitively through a kind of research protocol that these programs are effective. But what we're already seeing is that young people are using those resources to take care of themselves, in, quote unquote, responsible ways, if you will, and, and not, still ending up homeless once they're, receiving these kinds of resources. And I think that we saw certainly through COVID, the government has the capability to just give people cash. And the way in which that was very beneficial to people is something that I think that, frankly, we need to think more about in terms of our overall kind of safety net programs and the often high bar and frankly, demeaning sort of processes that people often have to go through in order to get very basic levels of resource to be able to survive.
Wow, that's so powerful. I've heard of I know of these direct cash transfer programs. I had not heard of any that were specifically focused on young people. And there's just so much, I think it's so powerful for so many reasons. One, because we know that actual cash is what people need oftentimes. Two, we put the power back in their hands by giving them cash. Three, it's teaching young people early on how to manage cash.
Yep.
And what to do with it, especially when they know this is your money for this period, and you have to rely on it to survive. So that's so powerful in so many ways, especially since it's youth led. I think you started to allude to when you talked about how people raise these concerns. Aren't you worried they're going to use it on drugs or anything of that such? Is this criminalization of young people, and I think of that as one of many issues that that we tend to gloss over or not talk about enough when we think about LGBTQI rights, LGBTQI equality, just the way our folks are treated more broadly. You've been an outspoken critic over the years of this idea that the movement was over once we got legal protection for gay marriage. You've always been that person that's nope, that's not it. We still need more. And I think a lot of people would agree with you now. Can you just elaborate on that critique? And if you think there is or will be a marker of queer liberation, what would what would that look like? When would we know?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're now seeing the ramifications of is the, kind of mainstream LGBT movement or the equality movement that really focused so much of our kind of time and resources, in the early, 2000s on kind of same-sex marriage, first at the state level and then at the federal level, that these organizations were ill prepared to deal with the kind of blowback that we're now experiencing around the country in terms of, I think I heard the other day that it's been 400 something anti-LGBT, but even more specifically anti-trans specific pieces of legislation that have been introduced at the local and state level around the country. And I think that we have been, ill prepared to deal with that in a way, because so much money and resources and so much of the narrative kind of was focused on same-sex marriage as kind of the apex issue for the LGBT community. So what happened is, in a way, a similar dynamic that happened kind of with HIV. that at a certain point, so in roughly 1996, when the antiretroviral medications came on the market and started saving people's lives, there was a great retrenchment from the late 90s into the 2000s from LGBT organizations kind of specifically working on HIV, right? Because of, frankly, rich white gay men got the meds they needed, and then everybody else was just sort of left to their own devices. That definitely happened. And I think we've seen a similar dynamic with kind of once the resources moved to same sex marriage, and then once that got achieved, then resources started to disappear for LGBTQ work, right? And we can think of a lot of major funders that in the last 5 years have like completely gotten rid of their LGBT specific funding dockets. So now LGBT groups are having to compete for resources with, other, kind of movement organizations or bigger, kind of institutions, number one. And then we even saw, when some states before the federal government passed same-sex marriage, like in New York State, right? The statewide organization, Empire State Pride Agenda, closed because largely they're funders, right? So they're kind of wealthy, mostly white gay donors were like, okay, well, we got married, so no need to support, the Empire State Pride Agenda. Meanwhile, the state did not have legal protections for the trans community, right? Which took another fight by, one organization, New York Transgender Advocacy Group, which I'm also on the board for, did a lot of the ground organizing to get that bill, the, agenda passed in New York State. And now there's a new kind of statewide organization in New York that has also come up sort of subsequent to that. But, but that is indicative of what happened in terms of the resources around same-sex marriage and then what it meant. So now we find ourselves as a movement in a situation where kind of, the growth of kind of white nationalism, white Christian nationalism, with these very well organized white nationalist organizations, right? Kind of paramilitary organizations around the country that have completely captured the Republican Party, right, at this point. And we have literally no response, right? There isn't I have not seen a national plan for how we protect LGBTQ organizations or even entertainment establishments, which include drag performers, right? And a lot of whom are trans women who do that entertainment. Organizations are figuring it out as we go, right? I'm in Cleveland, Ohio. Our, Pride in the CLE is this weekend. I'm also board chair of the LGBT Center of Greater Cleveland. And we are the main sort of sponsor of that event. But, we've had to try to figure out, a set of new kind of safety protocols given, A, just the amount of guns in this country, and B, what we've seen in terms of major, just mass shootings, to be honest. And I don't see any of the national organizations taking these issues on or creating strategies to help like local organizations and group deal with these things, right? And I think a lot of it was just that they were caught flat-footed, after marriage passed, because they didn't really have another agenda and didn't really think about, well, what happens if there's a major backlash to the kind of relative progress that we've made. And so the organizations are somewhat out to lunch. The funders have kind of left the space. And so it is left, kind of community-based organizations, LGBT centers, some of the state equality organizations having to kind of figure it out in the mix. And it makes me frankly really worried about, where we are and our ability to kind of meet the moment.
Yeah, it's a very uncertain picture here. All right, so I want to go back to I know very very early on in your movement work you were very active around issues around prisons, issues around criminalization and so forth. And a lot of your work has been at these the crossroads of issues affecting queer and trans communities and critiques of prisons. I guess one question is, why do you think abolition is necessary for LGBTQ liberation, and or vice versa?
In a way, I think it's because abolition is our mandate and our kind of birthright as queer people post Stonewall. the Stonewall riots, if we consider that as kind of the turning point, and of course there were things that happened before that, the Compton cafeteria riots, other moments of queer rebellion around the country. But if we sort of take the impact of Stonewall in terms of being a kind of national shift in LGBTQ organizing and activism around the country, kind of coming out of New York City, that particular set of incidents, that led up to Stonewall was about police violence, right? It was about the, reinforcement of old laws on the books that were, if you had to have on 2 out of 3, articles of clothing that were matched your, supposed gender, right? Or your, sex assigned at birth, really. Or you could fully be arrested. And the way in which, police did not intervene when queer people were attacked, in the West Village or other parts of New York City or around the country, right? And sometimes participated in that level of violence. So that was the catalyst for Stonewall, first of all, right? So it was actually, police violence and harassment. And when you look at some of the early work that happened at the Gay Liberation Front and, some of the organizations that were founded in the early 1970s, they were staunchly kind of involved in and connected to other sorts of movements, right? So one of the first marches that happened in New York by queer, LGBT activists was to march in front of the jail downtown that was holding Angela Davis, right, when she was arrested, right? And so Free Angela was a major kind of campaign of LGBT movement folks in the early 1970s, right? And I think so and that was before people knew Angela Davis was queer, right? So I think that, the idea about, prison policing, the prison industrial complex, if you will, mass incarceration, police brutality and violence, and a solution being envisioning and kind of moving toward a world without, kind of prisons and punishment as a way to deal with often just social problems that are centered around, frankly, poverty. The queer community was there from the beginning. And therefore, and our movement was founded essentially on some of those ideals. And so therefore, it is frankly to me, I consider myself a part of a long through line of that, movement history. If you look at, James Baldwin's work, a lot of his writings, especially essay writing, was about prison and police violence, right? It shows up in so much of his work. And that often gets kind of missed, right? So especially, by some of the mainstream LGBT groups who only want to talk about Giovanni's Room. But so I think that, for me, my sort of involvement in, sort of prison abolition movement and on staff at Critical Resistance or whatever was, one, just having lived through, having been harassed and by police, having watched what happened to family members in my communities through the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s, et cetera, was certainly a part of it. But also my life as a gay man was definitely impacted by prisons policing. And frankly, our movements come out of a critique of that. And so it is, to me, the work that the queer movement still should be upholding.
That kind of naturally leads into our last question. This is Pride Month. And, I think Pride is definitely, at least the way that Pride is honored, has definitely evolved from its original intention. And, obviously evolution isn't necessarily bad, but, I worry that in celebrating Pride, a lot of people forget, all of the things that you just mentioned, the legacy of Pride and what Pride was. It was a mass action against policing. And I guess I was wondering, what does Pride mean to you today?
Yeah, thank you. I think to me, Pride, it means, the sort of the joy and the blues, the both and the party and the struggle. It's the moment and the month, frankly, to, kind of commemorate our history, to remember, our history, both in terms of some of the things that have kind of happened in the last, roughly 5-10 years with a more focus on some of the kind of Black and brown folks who were, involved in the Stonewall rebellions early on. Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson often get mentioned. But that it was also a moment where, folks who are, out to party, right, essentially, also use that moment toward political aims. And I think that there should be we don't have to have, prides that are just parties or that are just, kind of political. I think that we can do both. And so for me, Pride Month is about doing both. It's both about, kind of partying and celebrating ourselves, our lives, our lovers, our families, etc. And it is to kind of remember, commemorate, reteach, re-educate with each new generation the struggles that it took to get us to this parade or to these parties, et cetera, right? And that happened because a lot of people literally put their lives on the line, for us to be here. And also, I think particularly given the current moment, is to remember that it doesn't take that far for us to kind of slide back to where we were, at some other point in history where, things were more repressive. I think that those are, for me, some of the reasons why I think that pride is still important. And I know there's a lot of kind of critique of the commercialization of pride and these other sort of things. And I agree with all of those critiques. And yet, and still, I think that I think parties and celebration are very important to people, right? I think pomp and circumstance is very important to people. And all those things are lovely. And I think we can do those things and also continue to build community and use pride for those reasons. And also to sort of put a stamp on our kind of political demands and our political vision for the future for LGBTQ lives now and in the future.
This has been absolutely amazing. As you were talking, I was taking notes of things. Gotta Google that. What's that about? So, I'm sure if I learned a lot, our listeners are also just gonna learn a lot from the wisdom that you've imparted. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Where can folks learn more about your work?
Sure. So you can, find me on, my website, or all the handles are just my name, kenyonfarrow.com or at Kenyon Farrow. And then any of the organizations that I'm associated with, places that I currently write or have written for, will also, pop up on the internet as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, you heard it. Follow Kenyon on all of the social media platforms. And until next week, we're out. Thanks again for joining us. Dismantling Injustice is brought to you by Envision Freedom Fund, an organization that works to transform the immigration and criminal legal systems while meeting the critical needs of individuals impacted by these systems daily. To learn more about our work and donate, visit us at envisionfreedom.org. That's envisionfreedom.org. Dismantling Injustice was created by Sally Israel. Our executive producer is Abigail Wolf and hosted by Carl Hammett Lipscomb. That's me. Special thanks to the team at Envision Freedom for being amazing. Until we're all free, peace out.